What's up, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are starting with the first movie in the Heisei era. But before we get to that, I just want to take a second to explain the Godzilla eras to you, because I've frequently been mentioning the Showa era, which is what we just finished with Terror of Mechagodzilla. The Godzilla eras are usually described in Japan by whoever is ruling at the time. So the Showa era was during the Showa period, and the Heisei era began while Godzilla 1984 was coming out and actually ran into the 2000s. And so as we go a little bit further, the Godzilla series becomes known as a TriStar, if you even want to call that an era, for Godzilla 1998. And then the films in the 2000s, technically the Heisei era was still continuing, and those are typically referred to as the Millennium series. Then, of course, we have the legendary movies, which are currently running, and the modern Japanese era is referred to as the Reiwa era. The classification comes from the ruling emperor in Japan, typically, but it's also a way of just categorizing the films in tone and style and how they kind of collectively work together. You see that the Showa era is kind of one style of movie, and then the Heisei era is a very different style of movie, but all the movies during that time kind of share those traits, so that's another way that you can kind of look at it.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching. I'm Jared Fearing.
I'm a lifelong Godzilla fan and a big fan of Halloween.
And nothing says Halloween like monster movies.
So this year, for the month of October,
we're going to review every single Godzilla movie, from Gojira all the way to Godzilla and Kong the New Empire.
So join me this month for a new video every single day and see if I go insane in the process. Let's get to it. Today we'll be going into a real mishmash of a movie, Godzilla 1984, if you're watching the Japanese version, or Godzilla 1985 if you're watching the American version. And there's a lot that differentiates the two and what might even be available for you to see. So today let's talk about Godzilla's very first reboot in the series, Godzilla, or as it's known now, Godzilla 1984. The movie Godzilla 1984 was actually just released as Godzilla in Japan. And now you can get it on Blu-ray as Godzilla 1984, but this is not actually what it was called when it came out. This version that is currently available on Blu-ray is actually the Japanese version that has been kind of given a modern American dub. But when it came out first, in Godzilla 1985 it was called, they had actually reshot substantial portions of the movie, and they brought back actor Raymond Burr from the original Gojira. This is supposed to be a direct sequel to the original, completely ignoring the fact that in the original movie Godzilla is reduced to bones. But it is supposed to be a direct sequel, and they brought back Raymond Burr to play his same character in the American version, which was the distribution rights were bought by Roger Corman's company, New World Distributions. Because of all the changes that the American version made, they had some musical score issues, they had some reshooting things. It was changed enough that now the licensing is a total legal mess, and the 1985 version with Raymond Burr has never been given a DVD or Blu-ray release. So you actually cannot find it unless you maybe find it online somewhere, or you have the VHS. So that's actually pretty crazy that such substantial changes were made, and you can't even find that version easily these days. Even this version, Godzilla 1984, it's still a little bit tricky to find, but this features the original Japanese version, and then it features the Japanese version with a modern US dub, so you can see it dubbed or subtitled. Okay, now that we've got these weirdo differences and release stuff out of the way, let's talk about the movie. It starts with a shipwreck. And this was a pretty novel idea at the time, honestly, but since this movie has come out, we see multiple movies starting at sea, including Godzilla 1998. So you see things that people are finding shipwrecks with everybody dead or everybody's missing in, like, Shin Gojira. Here, they find this ship. A reporter finds this ship goes aboard, and there's these disgusting, like, 1980s movie monster sea lice that have basically killed everybody, and they're all dehydrated and mummified. And they're pretty gross. They were pretty traumatic for me to see as a kid. They reminded me of the horror movie Ticks that had Alfonso Ribeiro, which is not a very good movie. But as a kid, it grossed me out. As an adult, you're like, what am I watching even? Anyways, they have the sea lice, and they're pretty gross, and they go back, and the lone survivor, they go back to Tokyo, and he's like, oh, I saw Godzilla, he caused this, essentially. And everyone's like, oh my god, Godzilla, he's been hibernating for 30 years, and he must have been woken up again by the nuclear testing, and, whatever. It's not a very good explanation for his return, especially given what happens in the original Gojira movie. But whatever, it's fine. It's a MacGuffin to get him back. There's some strong horror elements pushed during that opening shipwreck scene, especially with the gross lice. There's some spooky scenes of like hands falling down and just like people decomposing, and it's a really interesting way to introduce this new Godzilla to the 80s. But they only keep it going for that one sequence. After that, there's absolutely no horror aspects at all. So it's an odd little sequence that is, honestly, it's probably the best sequence in the entire movie. But it's just very strange that they started like that and then just completely move away from it. The sound effects of the sea lice, too, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure they're a reused sound effect from Kamacuras from Son of Godzilla. So keep your ears open for that. There's claims that the radiation from Godzilla is what made these sea lice huge, and that's why they're murderous now, and they fell off Godzilla. It's whatever for a story plot. It's kind of gross and weird. And they actually take this idea in the movie Cloverfield and kind of run with it, in that the sea lice from Cloverfield fall off and they're a lot more vicious and chase people down. It's just interesting to see that idea come back later in a different franchise. But yeah, the sea lice are gross and probably the best part of this movie, honestly. This is a soft reboot. So what that means is that everyone is still aware of Godzilla. They're still considering the first movie canon, but they're really ignoring the rest of the Showa movies. So at this point in the series, it's like Godzilla is alive, there's no other creatures. That's kind of what they're working with. And because they start going that route, they put more of an emphasis on Godzilla's desire to absorb radiation and him being radioactive himself. They start kind of focusing on that again. But it's not done as well as in the original, and it just kind of becomes like a sci-fi plot point that is just kind of like boring rabble, honestly. The movie leans heavily into the Cold War fears between the tensions of the Russians and the US, and as the movie progresses, that actually becomes kind of the main plot point. Godzilla destroys a Russian sub, and so Japan has no choice but to admit that Godzilla is back, which kind of takes some of the pressure off of the fact that a Russian sub was destroyed. They're like, it was Godzilla, it wasn't us, don't start another war. And so they have a meeting of the Japanese officials, the Russian officials, and the US officials. And immediately the US and Russian officials are like, let's nuke Godzilla, even though they've learned nothing from the original incident. Anyway, whatever. They want to nuke Godzilla, and Japan is like, no, let us try something else first. And then a major difference between Godzilla 1984, the Japanese version, and Godzilla 1985 is that the US and Russian officials agree not to use nuclear weapons against Godzilla because Japan is trying to work out the situation. But Russia stations a freighter off the coast of Japan, and this freighter is controlling their satellite that has access to the nukes. Godzilla destroys the freighter, and as a failsafe of that freighter being destroyed, it just automatically launches the nuke. And so the movie becomes more about this fear of a nuke hitting Japan than it does almost about Godzilla for a decent chunk of the movie. And then ultimately, the US are able to detonate the Russian nuke in atmosphere, and Godzilla absorbs that radiation, making him super strong, and he's able to go on like a very, very small rampage before the end of the movie. This movie also introduces the Super X. It's a vehicle that is made to fly around and shoot like freezing missiles at Godzilla. And it doesn't really do very much in this movie. It briefly knocks Godzilla out. But this Super X vehicle becomes kind of a staple of the Heisei era. You get to see it come back in improved versions, and ultimately becoming other machines that are more critical in the future Heisei film. So it gets introduced here, but it doesn't really do very much. Speaking of not doing much, Godzilla actually does hardly anything in this movie. He stomps around, he attacks one nuclear reactor, he destroys a couple buildings here and there, but they really underuse Godzilla, even though this is a reboot of Godzilla and they're trying to bring back the franchise. It was critically successful in Japan and financially successful in Japan, but it was kind of a flop in the US. And I can't help but feel that especially the US audiences want to see Godzilla destroying shit and doing more Godzilla-oriented things. And this movie is more of kind of a critique of government and the Cold War. But the actual Godzilla stuff is kind of boring, and there's not that much of it. He moves really slow. They were testing out a new suit, and the suit looks great mostly. The face is problematic in my opinion. The eyes still have Showa era eyes that look like puppet eyes. They look like a toy almost. But the rest of the Godzilla suit is starting to transition into those 80s effects that look more realistic and look more mean. But the eyes really stand out as just looking like a toy. To me anyways. There's some close-ups of a giant Godzilla that they made, an animatronic one that was almost 20 feet tall. And they made like a giant Godzilla foot that I think was 60 feet or something like that. And so some of those close-ups do look pretty cool. But overall, the suit is pretty underwhelming here. The face really bothers me. And this is the only movie that we see like this. Even in the very next movie, they've upgraded drastically. So obviously they knew that it wasn't a look that was working, and they changed it dramatically for the better afterwards. Some of the effects in and around the buildings are great even. You see a lot of scenes in this movie about buildings being destroyed and then the humans having a hard time escaping because stairways are missing or, you know, whatever. And it's an interesting thing to focus on, that these big monsters are destroying the cities and how that destroyed infrastructure actually affects the people that are trying to flee. Like I said, it's an interesting idea, but they do too much with it. It doesn't need to take up as much of the movie as it does. And again, I want to see Godzilla doing stuff. I don't really care about people having a hard time escaping a building. You can do that in one scene and get that idea across. I don't want a whole movie of that. If I wanted a whole movie of people traversing a destroyed city done much better, I would watch Cloverfield. In the end, they use like the sounds of birds to trick Godzilla like a dumb animal into walking up a volcano. And then he literally just walks into the volcano because they're playing this bird sound that apparently like he's attracted to the sound of birds or something. It's kind of a stupid idea that never comes back to my knowledge as I go through these movies. Maybe it does and maybe I'm an idiot, but I don't think it comes back. I don't really remember that. And it was never anything in the original, so it's really odd that they're like, oh yes, Godzilla, he follows the sounds of migrating seagulls, or whatever they came up with. It's just a dumb plot point, and they literally have Godzilla walk into an open volcano. Like, literally just follows the noise into the volcano. So they've gone from making Godzilla this kind of like intelligent, destructive force of nature to being like, he's so stupid, he literally followed a sound into an open volcano. So I hate that. And that's kind of the end of the movie. He falls in and they're like, oh, thank God he fell into a volcano. Whew, that was close. And that's it. For this movie, I'm actually not going to recommend it. The Heisei movies get increasingly better right away, the very next film. But this one is actually not a very good movie. It drags on, it feels really long, even though it's only an hour and 43 minutes. There's a lot of human jargon back and forth and Cold War stuff, but the actual Godzilla scenes are not that great, and there's not that much of it. A lot of it is just like him lying unconscious after he gets frozen with cadmium and stuff like that. So I'm not going to recommend this movie. I would say if you want to start the Heisei series, start with our next film, Godzilla vs. Biollante. We're into a new era, the Heisei era, so thank you for sticking with me. If you like these videos, like, comment, share, all that stuff helps me. And let's keep going because there's still a lot of Godzilla left to share with you here in October. So thank you so much, and I will see you next time for Godzilla vs. Biollante.